House on the Rock, the Gateway, Johannesburg.
There is a deception that has wrapped itself in the fabric of our generation. A deception so profound, so subtle, that we may never recognize that it's gripped us. It is not a deception of doctrine, because if you look around, there are sound doctrines everywhere, but it is the deception of distraction. Somebody say, don't be distracted. Look at your neighbor and tell your neighbor, don't be distracted. It is not that we have stopped listening because we listen. It is that we are listening to everything. But God did not place us here to simply fill our ears with sound, but we are here to discern the voice that matters. And yet the question remains, in a kingdom where chaos is the norm, how do we even know if silence is speaking to us? You see, the human soul was not designed for the level of noise that is in this generation. You see, I was talking to my folk at the restaurant that I'm redesigning the concept and the nature of the place, because they would play a lot of loud sound and so much high sound and blow up the speakers that I'll have to spend every other week to fix it. And yet the people who make a lot of noise don't bring coins. Yes, you may not get that. I came in one day and I saw a gentleman standing on the couch and jumping with a flood of women, and jumping and dancing and jumping on the seat. And I asked them, why would you let the gentleman stand there and jump on the couch? Because he's going to break it. And I sat there for some hours waiting for them to finish so I can access how much they spent. God. And once they were done, I said, let me see the bill. The bill can't fix the side table or the glass. Look at your neighbor and tell your neighbor, you were not designed for this level of noise. Tell somebody else, you were not designed for this level of noise. You see, you go to the bank, you don't hear noise, because that's where there is cash. Is someone with me? According to Sweeler, in 1988, he wrote on the cognitive load of theory that chronic exposure to high levels of noise and information can increase stress, reduce productivity, and impaired mental well-being. Babash, in his thesis, indicates that prolonged exposure to urban noise pollution, that is the traffic noise, the industrial sounds, and digital notifications, heightens the level of cortisol, the stress hormones, and now leading to increased anxiety, sleep disturbances, and even cardiovascular issues. Look at somebody and tell your neighbor, you were not designed for this level of noise. You see, studies by neuroscientist Amisher reveals that excessive noise disrupts the brain's ability to retain information and engage in creative thinking. And so as deep work requires silence, deep work requires solace. It requires solitude. And considering ancient wisdom and spirituality, many spiritual traditions, they emphasize silence and they emphasize solitude as a path to wisdom. And the Bible tells us in Psalm 46 and verse 10, it says, be still and know that I am God. You're suggesting that silence is necessary for deep spiritual connection. Look at someone and tell your neighbor, be still. Or slap somebody else and tell them, be quiet, be quiet. And tell somebody else, you were not designed for this level of noise. You see, great thinkers like Blaise Pascal observed that all humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Some of you cannot stay in one place. You always want to go somewhere. You always want to be in noise. You always want to be where there is always confusion. But you were not designed for this kind of noise. I want you to look at your neighbor and tell your neighbor, you were not designed for this kind of noise. Ancient philosophers from Stock to Eastern sages saw inner peace as a function of silence rather than external noise. And when you consider the evolutionary perspective, the human brain evolved in low noise environments, primarily in nature. For most of history, human life was structured around natural rhythms and with soundscapes of birds and winds and waters rather than car horns and advertisements. See, the dramatic increase in artificial noise is a terrible phenomenon, and our brains have not yet adjusted to this kind of noise. Look at your neighbor and tell your neighbor, don't adapt to it. Don't adapt to it. The modern world has turned up the volume on everything. You have your notifications and you have your podcasts with opinions and voices and alerts and so much that the silence now feels uncomfortable. We have been trained to equate loudness with importance, and we assume that what is trending must be truth, and that what is urgent must be necessary, that what is constantly speaking must be worthy of our attention. But I came to tell somebody, it is not every noise and voice that deserves your attention. Look at somebody and tell your neighbor, switch it off. But therein lies the deception. The loudest voice is rarely the right voice. God does not compete for attention. He does not shout over chaos. He does not engage in noise warfare. When he was ready to create the world, we are told that there was chaos everywhere. And for him to create, the first thing he did was to ensure that there was silence and chaos was put in perspective. And so those who only recognize God in the spectacular will miss him in the subtle. Those who only recognize God in the spectacular will miss him in the subtle, because God operates in the normalcy of our everyday lives that we miss him most of the times. Elijah learned this the hard way. He had seen God in fire. He had seen God in thunder. He had seen God defeat the prophets of Baal in a grand, spectacular way. But when he was at the lowest moment of his life, God did not come in fire. He didn't come in an earthquake. He did not come in a storm. He simply came in a whisper. Somebody say, let God whisper to you today. Let God. And herein lies a divine principle, that God will sometimes shake the heavens to get your attention, but he will whisper to test your devotion. In the last days, the Bible says, the famine that was prophesied in Amos 8 verse 11 is not a famine of bread or water, but a famine of hearing the word of the Lord. So it is not that God will stop speaking, but that many will lose their ability to hear him, because the noise of the world will drown out the whispers of God. And if you only seek him in earthquakes, if you only seek him in the spectacular, if you only seek him in the miracles, you will never learn to recognize him in the stillness. If you only follow God because you want to see him in the fire, if you only want to see God when he appears in the middle of the fire, you will not recognize him in the whisper. The question is not, is God speaking? The question is, have you trained your ears to hear him in the stillness? People of God, we are in a distracted generation. We are discombobulated by the noise of the age. And Elijah was exhausted. Jezebel had issued, a death threat, and the man who had once called fire from heaven was now running for his life. He was looking for an answer, but his desperation made him look in the wrong places. Child of God, don't let desperation push you in the wrong direction. Child of God, don't let desperation push you into wrong places. Look at your neighbor and tell your neighbor, don't let desperation push you in the wrong places. See, some of us are so desperate that all we care about is the solution and not the solution provider. Oh, you didn't hear what I'm saying. We're all caring about solution. And we have a generation of people who cannot sit under the word of God. They're looking for magicians dressed up in suits, because all they care about is solution and not the solution provider. Like many of us, he expected God to come in power. Like many of us, he expected God to show up in a grandeur way, in a kind of divine intervention that leaves no doubt that it has to be God. But instead, God came in a whisper. Somebody say a whisper. Somebody say whisper. Child of God, the greatest messages are not always proclaimed in thunder. Sometimes they are guised up in a whisper. The kingdom of noise teaches us that volume equals power, that distraction equals significance, that what is loud must be important. But the kingdom of God teaches us that the truth does not shout. Truth speaks softly, and it waits for those who are willing to listen. Look at someone and tell your neighbor, listen. Tell somebody else, listen. And so our generation has become addicted to loud noise. They have become addicted to the loud, but deaf to the deep. You see, deep only calls to deep. And that's why Psalm 42 and verse 7 says, deep calls unto deep as the noise of your waterfalls. All the waves and billows have gone over me. See, the depth of God calls to the depth of man. But for these to happen, something must subdue, and that thing that must subdue is noise. Somebody say, subdue noise. Child of God, the distractions of life will keep you spiritually shallow. Yes. But when you quiet yourself, the depths within you will connect with the depths of God. Don't let the things that happen around you distract you from the depths of God. Is someone hearing what I'm saying? The noise can be the lack around you. The noise can be the discouragement of friends. The noise can be the situation that's happening right in your place. Then the distraction can actually be your pedigree, where you're coming from, because nobody ever did well and nobody ever went anywhere. So you begin to measure yourself by that which your history provides you, but you don't have to allow yourself to be drowned by noise. Somebody say, don't let noise drown you. Neuroscience tells us that the average person consumes the equivalent of 147 newspaper worth of information every day. Our attention span is now shorter than that of a goldfish. We wake up and we reach for our cell phones before we reach for prayer. We hear 1,000 voices yet struggle to discern the one voice that matters. And the result of that is nothing but anxiety, because we are overstimulated but undernourished. We're confused because we hear too much but process too little. Look at someone and tell your neighbor, take some time and process it. Why this generation talk a lot of trash is because they don't process their thought. I remember growing up, my mother would say it to me over and over again, Papa, think before you talk. Think before you talk. Think before you talk. Tell somebody, think before you talk. No, look at your neighbor and that next another neighbor and tell them, think before you talk. Spiritual deafness has invaded us, because the frequency of God does not compete with the distraction of man. The enemy does not need to silence you. He only needs to distract you. Child of God, God's voice is not found in noise. When Elijah was running, God laid him to a cave, away from noise, away from the chaos. And then God did something strange. He sent an earthquake, but he was not in it. He sent fire, but he was not in it. He sent a storm, but he was not in it. And after all the noise had passed, he whispered. Look at somebody and tell your neighbor, God is whispering. Look at somebody else and tell your neighbor, God is whispering. And the question is why? The answer is pretty simple. Because the whisper of God is reserved for those who are close enough to hear it. Many of us are waiting for a grand display. We're waiting for the cataclysmic. We're waiting for the grandeur. We're waiting for the mysterious, when God is waiting for us to come closer so we can hear him speak to us. See, one of the greatest dangers or most dangerous assumption we have is that if God is silent, he is absent. But you need to understand that silence is not absence. Silence is an invitation. Look at somebody and tell your neighbor, God's silence is an invitation. And many times when God whispers, it is because he wants you to lean in. When God whispers, it is because he wants you to draw near. When God whispers, it is because if he has to shout, it means you are already too far. The whisper of God is not weak. The whisper of God is weighty. The whisper of God is not weak, but only those who seek stillness will hear it. God's silence is his way of delivering you from what I call the second-hand faith. God's silence is a way of delivering you from what I call the second-hand faith. You see, many of us have inherited faith. The faith that was handed down by our parents, the faith that was handed down by our pastors, the faith that has been handed down by some spiritual mentors. And some of their God concept actually are flawed concept. Hence, our faith concept is messed up. You see, we have lived off the zeal of others, believing because they believe, coming to church because they come come to church, dancing because they dance, trusting because they trusted. We fade on borrowed convictions, and we have warmed ourselves by fires we did not kindle ourselves. Walking in the chaos and the echoes of other people's faith, never pressing in to hear God for ourselves. And so God has to ordain silence. The silence not to abandon us, the silence not to relegate us, but it is to transition us from borrowed faith to personal conviction. Look at someone and tell your neighbor, the silence is to grow you. See, the silence is training our ears for the whispers of God. Silence is where God tests your maturity. Babies need noise. Infants have to cry for immediate attention. So they need noise to ensure that someone is around and someone is alert. And sometimes you feel you're grown. But I want to tell you that you are still a baby if you're waiting for someone to call you. You see, you know, if all you're looking for is someone to give you a call for you to feel loved, then you're still a baby. Look at your neighbor and ask your neighbor, are you still a baby? If your sense of belonging is tied to a ringing phone, you're still a baby. Look at someone and ask your neighbor, are you still a baby? You see, love that needs constant reminder is not rooted, but it is rented. Oh, you didn't hear what I'm saying. Maybe you pick that up next week. Look at someone and tell your neighbor, you're still a baby. You're still a baby. If validation is your oxygen, you're still a baby. If you measure love by presence rather than essence, because infants cry for attention, but the nature, or the mature rather, walk in assurance. You're still a baby. If you need to be noticed to feel seen, you're still a baby. If unseen love feels like unloved love, you're still a baby. True growth is knowing that love does not have to perform to exist. Oh, you didn't hear that. I wish I'm preaching to someone in here. You're still a baby. If absence makes you doubt connection, you're still a baby. If unreturned messages feels like unreturned love, you're still a baby. See, wisdom teaches that presence is deeper than proximity. You feel grown, but you're still a baby. If being alone makes you feel unloved, rather an opportunity entrusted to you by God for your sacred space and self-discovery. Babies crave being held. They crave being caressed. They crave being kissed. The mature learn and they stand. Look at someone and tell your neighbor, grow up. You're still a baby. If you measure relationship by what they give rather than who they are, you're still a baby. Infants take, but the mature give without a fear of depletion. You see, grown sons and daughters understand that when the father is silent, he is still present. Is someone hearing me? The mother eagle stops feeding the eaglet when it is time to fly. It will feed it all the time, but when it's time for the eaglet to fly, he ceases to give him food. She applies the principle of necessary discomfort. So the mother eagle not stop feeding the eaglet out of neglect. He doesn't stop out of neglect, but out of necessity. Look at someone and tell your neighbor, it is necessary. She knows that comfort is the enemy of flight, that as long as the eaglet remains dependent, it will never discover the strength of its wings. Child of God, growth demands discomfort. What feels like abandonment is often an invitation for you to rise. If provision is being withheld, perhaps it is because dependence is no longer your portion. What you see as rejection may be a divine push towards your validation and election. Look at someone and tell your neighbor, it's time to push forward. Look at somebody else and tell them, God is pushing you over the cliff because he wants you to fly. Child of God, the end of spoon feeding is the beginning of strength. And hear me by the Spirit, you will never know how strong you are until comfort is removed out of your space. See, those who stop feeding you are not always against you. They're not the enemy. There may be a calling for you to rise. Look at someone and tell your neighbor, you've been called to rise. See, maturity begins when you stop expecting others to do for you what God has called you to do for yourself. See, when the mother eagle stops feeding, the eaglet feels hungry. Look at their neighbor and tell your neighbor, you may feel hungry. Yes, tell somebody you may feel hungry. But he's kept you hungry because he wants you to fly. But the hunger that the little eaglet feels becomes a catalyst for its movement. Because instinct awakens when indulgence ends. Friends, the nest is not your destination. The eaglet was never meant to live in the nest forever. The mother eagle removes the ease of feeding because the sky and not the nest is its inheritance. Look at your neighbor and tell your neighbor, the sky is where you ought to be. Child of God, the breastfeeding has stopped because your wings are ready. A season of being catered to is always followed by a season of being commanded to soar. Every great transition comes with discomfort. Stop longing for the nest when you've been designed for the sky. I wish I'm preaching to someone in here. Can I preach to somebody before I close? Paul, can I talk to you? You have been designed for the sky. Sonny, you have been designed for the sky. Alex, you have been designed for the sky. Joy, you have been designed for the sky. Bisoye, you have been designed for the sky. Esther, you have been designed for the sky. Adekeyes, you have been designed for the sky. Treasure, you have been designed for the sky. Leon, you have been designed for the sky. Joy, you have been designed for the sky. Am I talking to somebody in here, or am I preaching to myself? I know that I've been designed for the sky, and in a time I feel discomfort, I know it's time to get ready to fly. Look at your neighbor and tell your neighbor, get ready to fly. Sweetheart, it is time for you to fly. And sometimes it may feel discomfort, but that discomfort is to push you so you can fly. Tell somebody, get ready to fly. Child of God, there is a hunger that forces flight. Am I talking to somebody here? There is a hunger that forces flight. When food is no longer served, the eaglet faces a choice. Either I remain in starvation or I stretch my wings and fly. See, the hunger, though it may be painful, is the very thing that compels the eaglets to fly. Turn to your neighbor and tell your neighbor, baby, fly. Tell somebody else, fly. Fly, fly. Don't stay here. You've been here for too long. Fly. Tell somebody, fly. Fly. If what once sustained you is now missing, perhaps you are meant to seek higher ground. Many do not fly because they never allow their hunger to push them beyond familiarity. And what you call a crisis may be the beginning of your flight school. Oh, you didn't hear what I'm saying. Oh, yes, ma'am. Maybe I'm preaching to myself. See, what you call crisis may be the beginning for you to get your flying license. What you call trouble may be the beginning for you to get into that air and fly. What you call a punishment may be the beginning for your promotion in disguise. What you call a downfall may be the beginning of the springboard for you to fly. Turn to somebody and tell your neighbor, baby, fly. Tell somebody else, fly. The sky is your home. The mother eagle does not stop feeding the eaglet because she is cruel, but because she knows it was never meant for the baby to stay small. Likewise, life will not always hand you what you need, not because you are forsaken, but because you are ready to rise. A child working with the Father must learn to trust the Father's presence even when the Father is saying nothing. God's silence is not rejection. It is a sign that He trusts you to grow. I'm closing. Tell somebody it's time to fly. How do I hear God in the midst of the noise? How do I hear Him in the midst of my challenges? How do I hear Him in the midst of my lack? How do I hear Him when things don't seem to be working right? How do I hear Him when I feel hungry and my bank account is red? How do I hear Him in the midst of the noise? If you are to thrive in a world of noise, you must develop a kingdom discipline, the discipline of hearing. Silence must be pursued, because the noise of the world will not stop for you. Is someone hearing what I'm saying? The noise of the world will not stop for you. Things may never change until you change them. You must stop for it. Jesus withdrew, the Bible tells us, to a solitude place. Early in the morning, He would go into a solitude place and spend time away from noise. And I've shared it with most of you in this house. There was a time in my life, every morning by 4 a.m., I'll go to the park and I'll just be silent, meditating and hearing God say to me. It was in the middle of that I heard God say fruits and veg. And I went to share with my friends and they laughed me, like the Bible does say, to scorn. They said, you so love fruits that now you're hearing fruits. But it was in the middle of my silence that I heard God say fruits and veg. It didn't make sense. Fruits and veg. And I began to go research, began to check. Silence is the place you need to be. The man who does not schedule silence will live in constant distraction. You have to learn how to schedule silence. The times you need to lock yourself away. Go away from the crowd. Spend some time with yourself and just think. Someone hearing what I'm saying? Just be silent and think. Number 2, you have to discern the divine frequency. God's voice does not compete for attention. No, it won't. His voice will not compete for attention. He does not shout over the world's chaos. The Spirit of God moves with peace, not anxiety. If what you're hearing produces fear, if what you're hearing produces confusion, if what you're hearing produces restlessness, it is not the whisper of God. Is someone hearing what I'm saying? Number 3, I'm closing. Obedience activates clarity. Obedience activates clarity. Some of us are waiting for a new word from God while we're ignoring the last thing he told us to do. See, the more we delay in obedience, the quieter his voice becomes in our lives. When you cannot hear God, what you need to ask is, what was the last instruction that God gave me? Is someone hearing what I'm saying? What was the last instruction that God gave me? Deep calls unto deep. Shallow hearts cannot hear deep things. Shallow hearts cannot hear deep things. God speaks to the capacity of your maturity. If your ears has been tuned only to earthly things, you will not recognize when heaven speaks. Elijah was looking for God in the fire. He was looking for God in the wind. He was looking for God in the earthquake. But when he finally recognizes the still small voice, the Bible says he wrapped his face in the mantle and stepped forward. This is the test for true hearing. That when he speaks, you move. You may not have the finer details. You may not have the entire thing. But when he speaks, you move. Is someone hearing what I'm saying? Abraham, the father of faith, he said, you've got to leave your father's house and go to a land which I will show you. He didn't show him the land, the place where he was going, but he said, leave. That's the first statement, first instruction. Leave. Some of us will ask God to where? Until he tells me, what to where? He said, move. To where? We're asking God to speak, but we have already decided not to obey if we don't like the answer. We want God to speak. God speak, God speak. But you have decided in your heart what you want to do. You've already told God in your mind that what he is telling, if what he is telling you does not match what you are thinking, then it is not God. And I said, that's why I don't like counseling people. You understand? I don't like it, but I have to. Because sometimes people already have the pre-designed mind of what they're going to do. Some people, so true hearing is not in receiving a word. True hearing is responding to the word. Jesus called Lazarus. He said, Lazarus, come forth. And he came forth. Come forth. Came forth. So if you're not moved at the whisper, you're not going to move at the thunder. Is someone hearing me? God is still speaking, but only those who step out of the noise will hear him. The kingdom we choose, the kingdom we stand with, determines how far we're going to go. And the truth is that we're standing between two kingdoms, the kingdom of noise and the kingdom of stillness. One is going to lead you to exhaustion. It's going to lead you to confusion. It's going to lead you to fear. The other one will lead you to clarity. Stillness will lead you to strength. and it will lead you to peace. The voice you hear will determine the kingdom you live in. And I pray this week that you will make room for the whispers of God. I pray that you will step out of the distraction and turn off the noise. When God speaks, that you will wrap yourself in his presence and step forward. Stand up on your feet.